So I think we'll get started now. So I welcome everyone, all the participants. If you're wondering if it's a good idea to build walls around trees, then you're in the right place. If you don't know anything about church forests, then you're also at the right place, because we do have an expert on that, and I will introduce him in a minute. Here with me, we also have Rowan Alessiola. She is a climate protection fellow with the Humboldt Foundation at the University of Koblenz-Landau and the Peace Academy, where I'm the scientific director. Let me introduce you to Pete. Peter Klepeis is a professor for geography. He has an expertise in society and nature relations. He has field research experience in Mexico. He has worked in Australia, and now, of course, he's focusing on Ethiopia, which he will be presenting on. He's not only doing the research that he will be presenting now, he's also teaching, and just two of my favorite classes. One is called The Geography of Happiness, if I get the title right, Pete, and the other one is in What's in Your Cup. So maybe we can ask also some questions later on about those seminars. I definitely wanted to take those, and with that, I suggest I hand over to you, Pete. You can share your screen. The presentation, we agreed on about 40 minutes, a few minutes plus or minus, give and take. And then we will start with the discussion that follows the presentation. So Pete, I hand over to you, and yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, JP. And I appreciate the work you, Jürgen and Rowan have done to organize the event. And I very much thank the Peace Academy for giving me an opportunity to share my research with you. I would like to also take the time just to acknowledge the fact that there's ongoing violence in Ethiopia. My research and presentation won't address those issues, but I'm very much thinking about the challenges facing the Ethiopian people during this difficult time. What I'd like to do today is to use the church forest example to engage with a long-standing debate about how outsiders perceive nature-society relationships in Africa. Certainly a lot of scholars have highlighted how, going back to the colonial period, often outsiders will characterize the African environment as being in some form of crisis. And this may be linked to the use of fire or land management that may be perceived as leading to desertification or deforestation. And often this scientific imaginary provides a logic for why these crises are occurring, linked to population pressure, linked to poor management, agricultural expansion, and those kinds of things. And these scientific imaginaries have been critiqued quite extensively and often found to be not matching the reality on the ground. That in fact, local people in Africa often are quite capable of adapting to changing environmental conditions and are very good environmental managers. So I'd like to use church forests, which are an example of a global phenomenon, often referred to as sacred forests or sacred groves. And you can find examples throughout Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world where religious groups or communities will protect nature, forests in this case, for reasons that are very much rooted in their religious tradition. So church forests are a good example of that. They're also, I think, an example of a type of environmental crisis that a lot of outside groups are using to justify interventions. So we see scientific groups, non-governmental organizations, other institutions arguing that church forests are in danger of disappearing, that there's a crisis and there needs to be an intervention. And the intervention of choice is to build walls around the forests, to provide funds to the community where the community members are doing the wall building, but the impetus for the construction comes from these outside groups. So I'd like to use this presentation to give you an overview of the church forest story, to think about protection regimes that have been in place thus far, and to think about what role outsiders have in protection of the forests going forward, and whether walls should be part of that. Okay. All right. So if you look at a Google Earth image of northern Ethiopia, you're likely to see a landscape that is largely devoid of trees. Certainly, there's been a huge eucalyptus boom in the country for many, many decades, and lots of landholders are planting eucalyptus for all kinds of important reasons. It's a cash crop. It's used for building, for fuel wood, and so forth. But if you're going to focus on native vegetation, these small pockets of native vegetation really stand out quite clearly on the landscape. And these are the church forests. So you'll normally have a round church building, either at the center or near the center of the forest. And then you'll have this forest of various sizes. I'll give you some details in a moment surrounding it. They're also quite distinctive on the ground. Again, you don't have a lot of forest cover in northern Ethiopia, and church forests are often located on hills, and so you can see them from quite a long distance away in many cases. Here's another example of a forest that you can see from the ground. And you can see a little bit of the church forest building there peeking out. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has been protecting church forests for hundreds of years. The estimates vary widely, but certainly many hundreds of years, according to most guesses. And of course, there's a question about to what degree these are remnants of what might have been a vast forest that covered northern Ethiopia in the distant past. Many people will point to standalone native trees like the one in the foreground there and argue, well, that's apart from the perimeter of where the church forest boundary is now. And so perhaps the forest used to actually be much larger. So I'll come back to that narrative in a little bit later in the presentation. I'd like to share with you 3 examples of prominent outlets that have highlighted a crisis narrative about the church forests. The first is the journal Nature, one of the most important science journals in the world. And these, they had an article in 2018 that very much celebrated the work of a forest ecologist, Alamayiwasi, a colleague and friend of mine, who has been advocating for the protection of church forests for a few decades now. He and another ecologist established a non-governmental organization called the Tree Foundation. And they are among the groups that have very aggressively tried to convince local communities to build walls around the forest. Now you can see this image. I'll show you some zoomed in photos of the walls themselves, but these are very tall, thick walls and a very stark divide between the green forest and the surrounding landscape. I will note that this is a particularly small example of a church forest, and the choice to this time of the year shows the contrast between the brown and the green quite dramatically. And I'm not sure that that's always the case when there's more rainfall. But they talk about the lush wild habitat of church forests and highlighting the wild element of them. And yet these are very much humanized landscapes. People are in the forest every day. There are regular church services. So they're not wild in that sense, although they are clearly the most biodiverse places in northern Ethiopia. The article describes a mushrooming population, the way in which Ethiopia's forests have been sacrificed to agriculture to feed this mushrooming population, and they suggest that the country used to be much more forested in the not too distant past. Another example of a prominent outlet, National Geographic, a magazine in the United States that I think has a worldwide readership. They also show a pretty small and very degraded church forest, by all I can tell. They are highlighting in their article the hot, dry fields that are only a few steps away. They highlight also the mushrooming population, or the rapidly growing population in this case. And they do reference this Tree Foundation work again, and the term they use is protective walls to save less than 5% of the forests that remain in northern Ethiopia. The final example I'll use is from the New York Times. Here, a filmmaker interviewed Alamai Uwasi, the ecologist I mentioned earlier. And this was the most dramatic example of language regarding the church forests, saying that they are withstanding environmental destruction, but just barely. They are also highlighting the deforestation narrative, and very much celebrating the role of outsiders, the role of science in collaborating with the local churches, and arguing that that's doing some good in the world. If you zoom in and you look at the walls that are being built, they are about 1 meter wide and maybe 1.5 meters tall or so. So they're quite substantial. And the logic is that they prevent cattle and other livestock from entering the forest. And it is certainly true that livestock can eat seedlings or trample seedlings. These walls are also meant to prevent sort of the casual person entering into the forest and maybe collecting fuel wood. They certainly are a delineation of the boundary between the surrounding landscape and the church forest. So there are lots of reasons why these are seen as a barrier to pressure farmers who might want to expand their field a little bit more into the forest because of perhaps land scarcity issues. So very much a kind of a blunt instrument to prevent livestock and people from encroaching into the church forest. So that's the logic behind them. So I'd like to spend about another half an hour or so, and then I'm looking forward to questions, to share with you some basic information about the church forest story. Up until 10, 15 years ago, there still was not a lot known about how many church forests there are, how big they are, whether they may be remnants of a forest in the distant past. And certainly there have been worries about them for at least 20 years when Alamai Uwasi started his dissertation work, but still not entirely clear how vulnerable they really are. So I'll share that with you, talk in a bit more detail about the ecological and social significance of the forest. Why do people value them? I will give a synthesis of the existing protection measures and the role of walls right now. And then I want to consider the question, in the face of potential factors in their degradation, what steps should be taken and by whom to bolster church forest protection? Should the role of outsiders be celebrated? Should the building of walls be celebrated as an important step in protecting forests going forward? Or perhaps are there other strategies? Now, my research colleagues and I have as our case study area the administrative zone of South Gondar in northern Ethiopia. This is in the Amhara regional state. All those little green dots you see on the map on the upper right there are church forests. So there are well over 1,000 of them in South Gondar and many more beyond. And I'll share those data with you in a moment. I am using data from the larger project to tell this story, but I want to be clear, my interpretation of what's going on is my own. I am a geographer and more specifically a political ecologist. So I use a political economy perspective to consider issues of how nature may be managed, access to natural resources, how different stakeholders perceive nature in unique ways. I'm interested in how people have materially modified nature. For example, there's good evidence that people have been planting in church forests for a long time. So they are very much human constructions, social constructions. And certainly the way in which people perceive nature, are these perceived as humanized landscapes or are they perceived as wild landscapes? That may influence perspectives on how they should be protected or managed. So those are the kinds of questions that drive much of my research. Again, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues. We have many collaborators in Ethiopia at Bahir Dar University. Many faculty and students at Colgate University have been involved. as well as the University of Puget Sound and Skidmore College, and a research unit in Germany as well. We have funding from Colgate as well as the U.S. National Science Foundation. The project as a whole has used a mixed methods approach, both quantitative and qualitative methods. The ecology team, oh, and I should mention that the overall project is made up of ecologists, religion scholars, anthropologists, human geographers, physical geographers, so very much representing different realms of knowledge and expertise. The ecology team has been on the ground assessing biodiversity, soils, regenerative capacity, the overall ecological health of the forests. We've been using satellite imagery and historical air photos to map for church forest extent. We have conducted representative random samples and surveys of inhabitants of church forest communities. And we have also conducted ethnographic work. So Isabella Orlowska has conducted ethnography in 5 church forests. I've collaborated with her, and we've conducted semi-structured interviews, in-depth interviews with local government officials, priests, other members of the community. We've walked the church forest land holdings and produced sketch maps and conducted archival work. So very much drawing on lots of different types of data and qualitative and quantitative both. So let me continue and first share some basic information with you about church forests. First of all, it's very easy to map church forests today using Google Earth, for example, and I showed you an example of that. To try to get a sense of what kind of changes there have been through time, we were lucky enough to be able to get access to, there was a US spy program called the Corona Project. And so we have air photos from our study area from 1962 linked to that project. And then when Italy occupied Ethiopia in the 1930s, they did take some aerial photographs, not very good spatial coverage, but enough that we could get some idea of how changes occurred since the 1930s. That's the earliest spatial data we have. The research from today has identified in our swath across the South Gondar study area, 1,022 church forests. But in Amhara regional state, there are over 8,000. So church forests are common. They are about 5 hectares in size, although that varies from just a few hectares to over 100 hectares. They tend to be about 2 kilometers apart, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. It may be the distance that it's easy to walk to church services on a Sunday. About a fifth of the forests we studied, so those 1,022, had 50% crown closure, meaning they had an open canopy, which suggests sort of weak ecological health, poor regenerative capacity, and so some sign of degradation, to say the least. When we were trying to establish whether or not population pressure might be a factor in the size of forests, we used as proxies distance to road in town, and there was no relationship. So we don't see any real justification, at least for that neo-Malthusian argument of population pressure affecting church forest size does not seem to be operating. We also have seen remarkable stability in church forest size. So here we see 1962 to 2012. We see the area of the native forest right around the church as pretty stable. We do see an area outlined in yellow that is a eucalyptus plantation. So I'll talk more about the eucalyptus boom, but churches have been using eucalyptus not only to earn money for the church, but also to establish control over or to demonstrate control over certain land holdings. So if you look at the 1,022 forests that we studied, and you include the eucalyptus that may be grown along the edge of the church forest, we actually see an increase in forest size. Now, there's a good reason maybe that you don't include the eucalyptus. Certainly there are negative ecological impacts on water table, on soil conditions. And so a lot of ecologists would argue that that's not a good sign for the native vegetation. but it is something that we might consider. You have seen in the last 50 years a decrease of almost 17% in crown closure. So a sign that there are processes of degradation going on. And so there's a certain degree of vulnerability for church forests. When we push back a little bit further in time, you can see the flight lines of the Italian imagery. Again, not as extensive as we might like, but we do see a few examples of church forest that we can capture for our 3 different periods, and remarkable stability, right? So you look at the lower figure there, the forest size, it may have declined slightly, but it's certainly within the margin of error. What we do see is a harder buffer. So the edge of the church forest and the surrounding landscape has become quite stark. So we're assuming that in the past, you may have had shrubs, taller grasses in the surrounding landscape, and there may have been more of a gradual transition between the church forest in that landscape. And now the shrubs and the grasses have been converted to agricultural lands or grazing lands, and that's probably why that edge has become more stark. Let me move on to the socioecological significance in forest protection. The ecological significance is easy. Church forests are by far and away the most biodiverse places in northern Ethiopia. They are rare and they are relatively small. They do provide important ecosystem services in terms of things like pollination, effects on the hydrologic cycle. They sequester carbon, so there are climate implications. And ecologists, among others, are really celebrating these ecological benefits. And that has been driving the main concern, at least among these outside groups to date, for why they should be protected. Socially, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been protecting church forests for hundreds of years. So church doctrine dictates that you should have a forest surrounding church buildings, and I'll describe more about that in a moment. So we definitely have a kind of an edict on high from the church hierarchy that local communities should protect church forests. So this is akin to kind of a preservation model, right, where keep nature protected, preserved as it is. But we also see church forests as a form of common property management. Local people are the ones who are embracing the norms of protection, in particular behaviors around church forests. In most cases, you do not have guards preventing people from accessing the forest. These are open to anybody. Now, there are rules about who should enter and access to the more sacred spaces in the church, but they are open to the community. And the community is policing the protection of the church forest. So they're the ones who are discouraging people from grazing or gathering fuel wood or cutting trees. Certainly, the local priests would fine people or otherwise punish them if they were caught, but it is very much a community-based effort. I will note that these are not private lands, these are government lands that the government allows the church to control. So certainly government is also a stakeholder in this case. Now here's a drone image that we took. You'll note that there are 2 churches in this particular church forest. That's unusual, although it's becoming more common as wealth gradually increases in the area. And benefactors will donate money to church communities, and they often will build a second church to a second patron saint. So that's what that is. The logic of having a forest around the church is linked to the fact that within each church building, there is the Tabot. This is a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, so wooden tablets. And that is considered sacred. The closer you are to the Tabot, the more sacred the space. So there's a sacred geography to the church forest. Church forests are part cemetery, part community center. There's a tradition of burying people in the forest, and the more important you are in the community, the closer you will be buried to the Tabot and the church building. There's also a tradition that you honor the Tabot by having a form of protection around it. So the forest represents protection, represents kind of a clothing for the church and the Tabot. So this is a very strong tradition that has been established a long, long time ago, and is sort of the basic rationale for why the forest should not be disturbed unless it benefits the church and the Tibetan. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The other thing that happens, I mentioned there are church services held here every week, and gatherings for rituals and so forth. There are burials that take place. There are also gatherings of subsections of the congregation. These are called mahabars, and these are associations that will honor a particular patron saint. After church service, either in structures we call mahabar houses or just clearings underneath the forest, you'll have gatherings after church service where food and homemade beer is shared. Here's an image of the inner clearing, the ring right around the church building itself, where rituals and gatherings take place, a very sacred space. So there are measures that restrict who can access this space. On the upper left, you see an example of a clearing, and there's a church in the background. It's a little hard to see, where one of these associations or mahabars might gather. It's very common for churches to have access to a spring, either within the church forest or just nearby, and holy water is sold, so it's a source of income for the church. And there you see a structure in the church forest in the bottom there, which is used to prepare tela, which is the local beer. Certainly, funerals are taking place in the church forests or the compound. There are funeral gathering grounds. So this is part of sort of the geography of your typical church forest. There are church schools for training the priesthood right on the outskirts of most forests as well. So why are they valued? They're valued for burial grounds, obviously funerals, religious services and other rituals, these association meetings. Individuals will go into a church forest for prayer and contemplation. You have schools operating there, and the students will be accessing the church forest every day. You do have material modification of the forest if it benefits the church. So you might cut a tree down to repair the church building or for some other structure. You might use fuel wood if you're preparing food for a church service. Holy water, natural resources that you might sell, timber and grass. Certainly the churches are often used to shelter widows or travelers or those kinds of people. So a mix of reasons why they're valued. They are, and these the norms of protection of church forests have been in place for a very long time, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. There are lots of changes afoot, however. We certainly see road building, we see lots of construction in urban areas, eucalyptus economy is still thriving. Most landholders are planting eucalyptus for both personal use and for sale. Churches are also involved in this. You can see in the center there's a church building and then a tree that has a red mark showing it's going to be cut soon, eucalyptus. Churches have been, as I'll talk about in a moment, having access to land issues because of political shifts, and eucalyptus does provide an important source of income. You'll see examples where churches are planting crops like coffee, even in the sacred inner circle. We also see increasing land pressure. Cash crops, chat, for example, is a crop that is being produced more and more in the region. I was able to document people, women and children, gathering fuel wood from a church and taking it outside for their own use, which is not allowed under the norms of protection that have been in place for a long time. In the lower right, you see a woman with a cow in the inner circle, also something that's not allowed. So you see, in some cases, a weakening of these norms of protection, and I can talk about why in a moment. As wealth gradually increases in the area, and this is still quite a poor region, don't get me wrong, but you see earthen burials where a site might be used many times over the years. You're starting to see more permanent markers to those burial sites, including concrete, in some cases even structures, we call them grave houses, but more dramatic structures that that lead to a more permanent disturbance of the forest and perhaps affects regenerative capacity and ecological health. As we see more benefactors donating money to the church, I mentioned these second church buildings. You can see in the lower right, the older church in the background and the newer one in the foreground. And on the left, we see a round traditional church in the little inset, and then a very large, more dramatic church that has been built in addition. We certainly have had over the years with the Derg regime, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, land reform where lands have been redistributed and in some cases land taken away from the church and given to other members of the community. So churches have lost the ability in some cases for income. And that's going to be part of the story in terms of why wall building might help establish control over particular land, so more land isn't taken away. There has been violence, not only today, but in the past during the Derg period. And we do see examples of illegal cutting during that period, fires. Our survey research shows that women in some cases have different attitudes about church forests than men. Unfortunately, there are examples of gender-based violence taking place within church forests, and women who responded to our survey said, and they were interviewed face-to-face, said that they actually often prefer a more open canopy, a more open forest, because maybe it's easier to see who might be hiding in there. So it seems that one shift that may be taking place is that women may not be as interested in enforcing these norms of protection because of that. We also see some generational differences where younger people are still quite religious, don't get me wrong, but they tend to not go to church services as often, meaning they're not taking a part as often in these associations where there's gathering after the church service, you're interacting with members of the community. It's a way of building strong social capital in connection to the church forest as an important space for you. And they're also having more of an orientation towards secular authorities. So going to local government for, say, conflict resolution, perhaps rather than the church hierarchy, which is a shift. I mentioned the uncertain land tenure because of land reform. So before these outside groups got involved in wall building, you did have a relatively small number of churches building walls to demarcate the land that the church controlled compared to land that local regional farmers might be in control of. And here you can see a rather sturdy wall in the distant background at the perimeter of the church forest proper, but a less dramatic wall a little bit further away, which is indicating the boundary for the church property. So both, you certainly do see a desire for some people to have a wall that will prevent cattle from walking on graves, and there's this sense that cattle shouldn't be in the forest. And so walls are appreciated for that reason. But generally, when church forest communities are building walls on their own, it has to do more with the land tenure issue. You also see eucalyptus, in addition to serving the economic needs of church forests, they are also used as a way of indicating control over land. So the church can maintain control over that. We see rising population in northern Ethiopia, and new churches are being built, and there is not any native forest that can surround them. And so we asked people, what does that mean? And they say, well, you need to have forest. And if that means you have to plant eucalyptus, which is fast growing, you do that, as well as perhaps native trees. And we said, well, does that matter in terms of your traditions? And they said, well, you'd rather be well-dressed than wearing shabby clothing, but at least you're not naked. So the idea is that, yes, you do need a forest, although that may be a eucalyptus plantation to honor the Tabat, but it doesn't necessarily have to be native forest. So that gives you a little bit of a sense, and I'm trying to be efficient here and giving you enough of the story so that you understand what I mean, but not go on and on and on. Let me return to the points I made at the very beginning about how people perceive nature. And there are some scholars who are arguing that the members of the church forest community and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church are, in essence, practicing a form of eco-theology, that they have religious-based traditional ecological knowledge. I certainly agree that there's rich knowledge about flora and fauna in the church forests that a lot of people in the community have. But I tend to agree with my colleagues who are part of my project, Eliza Kent and Isabella Orlowska, who are arguing that it's perhaps more accurate to call community members accidental environmentalists, that the conservation of the forest in an ecological sense is really an accidental byproduct of a desire to protect, safeguard the purity of the Tabot. So there's not a sort of an environmentalist rationale that local people are using. It's for another reason. Now, I'm actually, I think Jim McCann is in the audience there, so hopefully he'll appreciate that I learned something from him. But he came to Colgate and gave a presentation a number of years ago, and I'm stealing a few of his ideas here. He noted that Al Gore, in his book Earth in the Balance in 1992, referenced a very dramatic rate of deforestation in Ethiopia, saying that its forested land had decreased from 40 to 1% in the last 4 decades. The Food and Agriculture Organization has also estimated a high rate of deforestation in Ethiopia. And again, if you look at the landscape and you see these standalone native trees, it's perhaps reasonable to assume that this was once much more forested. And yet, a geographer in the 1990s, when looking into the origins for deforestation data, noted that the figures were often reproduced indiscriminately in reports and papers without referencing or referring to their origins or to methodologies to which the data is obtained. So where are these estimates of earlier forest cover coming from? Certainly, prior to the 1970s, you didn't have good spatial coverage. Satellite imagery came along in the 1970s, so that's when you really start to see more accurate estimates. Lots of examples in which reports and papers are using inconsistent definitions of particular regions or what constitutes a forest. You see examples of political agendas benefiting from a degradation narrative, sort of justifying, much like I mentioned earlier, if there's a crisis, outside influence being necessary and people coming in and getting involved with the local community. There's also very good evidence that tree planting in church forests has occurred both in the past and is ongoing. So they are actually being tended in that sense. Now, again, Jim has been looking into, for various parts of Ethiopia for a long time, historical documents, paintings, and explorer accounts, which raise some questions about this larger deforestation narrative. We have Nissen et al. Using repeat photography. Here you see an image from 1905 in the upper left and 1868 in the upper right, where forest cover in the distant past seems to be not very extensive. When Nissen et al. Actually were interviewing people about the distant past, and people were saying, well, at the time of our grandparents, everything was forest here. And then the researchers showed them the photographs, and the people just didn't believe it. And this is an example of how the deforestation narrative, this perspective that may be perpetuated by outsiders and the scientific imaginary that I was talking about earlier, may actually be changing how local people perceive their own landscape. So that is becoming conventional wisdom, not just outside of Ethiopia, but within Ethiopia. Again, definition of terms are important. When we were doing our work, it was clear that what some people considered to be a forest, and we imagined it as this tall, big, tall, large trees, some people might actually be thinking about smaller trees or even shrubs and more scrubby vegetation. So are we talking about the same thing is the question. Now, regardless of whether these forests are remnants of a native forest, if it's secondary growth, or if they're cultivated gardens, certainly they are unique. They are highly biodiverse. And I very much celebrate their protection and want to see them protected. There are lots of outside actors who are advocating for protection. So UNESCO created the Lake Tana Biosphere Reserve, which covers part of our study area. You've seen in the last 20 years, lots of scientific researchers getting involved. You've seen NGOs like the Tree Foundation and the German NGO NABU involved in aggressively trying to protect church forests. And the Ethiopian government and local government, national and local, are both involved in trying to encourage church forest protection. Just to look at NABU, for example, since a lot of you are in Germany or from Germany, they are arguing for the protection of church forests largely on ecological grounds. So saying that they shelter sites, the sites shelter species and biodiversity, they buffer against climate change, right? And so that's the reason to protect them. Advocating stone walls as well as tree planting. So I see the narratives as very much invoking elements of what Melissa Leach and Robert Mearns in their seminal book in 1996 called The Lie of the Land argued. There's an edited volume highlighting how this neo-Malthusian understanding of nature-society relationships in Africa, emphasizing population, poverty, mismanagement of the land, actually was a hegemonic scientific imaginary. They argue that if you actually look at the purported cases of deforestation or desertification or of fire leading to destruction, that often those are erroneous, and that more careful work by people on the ground exposes ways in which people actually are quite effective managers of the environment, and that more careful research needs to be done. So despite that, I think the church forest example is sort of repeating some of the same mistakes as past outsiders. So we have a team of ecologists, and these are colleagues of mine. Kat Carluce is an ecologist at Colgate, but she and Alamayu and Meg Lohman, another prominent ecologist, noted in the journal Science that there's a conservation crisis and that we need to protect church forests, the ecosystem services of church forests, that immediate aggressive approaches are needed. They do reference the need for including all stakeholders and collaboration and empowering local people, which is good, and I'm happy about that. But then they immediately say, look, we have to immediately establish perimeters to prevent grazing. So this is sort of, on the one hand, we're seeing some acknowledgement that local involvement is important and their voices are important, and yet the solution has already been decided on, and that should be pushed to conserve. The Tree Foundation has been holding workshops to educate priests about the conservation work, which seems to suggest that they want to introduce an environmental ethic to the priests. They see that the protection systems to date are not working very well. So very much a top-down flow of information from the science community to local people. Meg Lohman in the journal Bioscience recently in 2017, I guess that's still recent, again invoked a deforestation narrative, invoked the normal factors involved, said that stone walls were needed right away and they were an important solution, and that because the priests were sanctioning this, that must mean the local people do as well. But they were holding workshops to educate the priests so that they would sanction this. So there's a little bit of a question about the process here. So to wrap up, since I've been going on for a while, there are certainly dynamics within church forest communities in Northern Ethiopia where we're seeing changes affecting materially church forests and perhaps how they're perceived. We talk about those generational differences, for example. And certainly there are outside actors who are characterizing church forests in particular ways and want to engage with church forest communities to protect these spaces. When I think about the question of should they be involved and how should they be involved, I come to thinking about sustainable development. And if you would like to achieve sustainability, you not only need to maintain or enhance ecological conditions, and that's really what the outside, at least in terms of these NGO activity that in the wall building, that's what they're really focused on, but not so much on the economic and the social realm. And there are critically important economic and social shifts afoot and needs that the local community requires. And that may be part of why we're seeing protection systems not working as well. So I would argue that these other realms are not being adequately embraced. My colleagues Kent and Orlowska have suggested process issues as well. They say outside communities are important, and adaptive management that includes outsiders is important, but people need to interact responsibly with the local people, the traditional managers of church forests. And that starts with accurately and deeply understanding the norms and values that govern it. And I don't think that has been happening to date. So to sum up, church forests are dynamic spaces. I think collaboration with outsiders is reasonable and perhaps necessary to protect church forests, but it needs to rely on a knowledge building process. And I think just communicating with priests, for example, is ignoring a lot of voices in the community, including women and young people. And those voices, I think, need to be empowered. Unfortunately, the dynamic thus far, the NGO activity seems to ignore this inequitable power dynamic between the scientists and the local people. And it seems to perpetuate an ecological crisis that I think is overstated and weights the ecological values and ignores some of the serious development needs in the community. So I'm going to stop there and we can talk about any questions you may have. Let me end my show here and stop sharing my screen so that I can engage with any questions or comments that people have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the detailed presentation that you've given us. In the chat, I think we don't have really a question, but they're just acknowledgements of in regards to what you've been presenting. But I have a question. This is a very interesting presentation, and I'm happy at least there's someone recognizing the accidental environmentalists in the community and their work, which is very good. But again, I'm a little bit concerned about the involvement, because we can see they're really conserving the church, the forest itself. But I'm looking at the bigger picture. Why aren't they also transferring the knowledge that they are gaining here to the areas of where they're living? Because from the pictures that you have shared, we've seen we only have a section of the church, and after the church, it's completely a total different environment. Why aren't these local communities transferring this conservation concept to the places where they're living? Then again, there's an interesting bit about the women and the youth, and they have different opinion about what is happening. So does it mean that they are not involved in the tree planting in these churches, or they just left out? Then thirdly, also, we have the priests being trained on forest conservation. So are they being trained as TOTs, trainer of trainers, so that they can also train the local community for them to be able to implement, or are they just being trained to do the conservation themselves? Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I'll start with the last one. My understanding is that the workshops are to convince, these are the head priests. So there are many priests for any given church congregation, but one is known as the head priest. And so gatherings, they were actually paid to come to workshops, and they were told why the forests are ecologically valuable. And the hope was that they would then go and during congregation services and other opportunities that they would explain to the community why the forests were needed to be protected. And I think the logic there is that that there wasn't a sense of sort of the ecological value. You mentioned, why aren't they transferring the knowledge that is local people to the surrounding landscape? I think it's because they are not necessarily valuing the ecosystem services, to use the language of science. People are aware of what's going on. In fact, they will say, look, eucalyptus, people know, there's been a lot of research that demonstrates that they know that it might affect the water table negatively or soil conditions negatively, but it's kind of a miracle tree, right? It is definitely benefiting them economically. So I think there's a kind of a disconnect between the outsiders who think that if they train the priests and convince them that there's environmental value, that will kind of trickle down into the community. I don't think it's, as you say, TOTs where they are then, training other people. I haven't heard any examples of that. Now you asked a question about the women and the youth. Could you rephrase that again? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting that the women and the youth, the youth, they don't come to church. So, I mean, they don't really value the conservation part of the church. But the women have different ideas about how the conservation should be done. Does it mean that they're not involved in the conservation programs in the church, or are they just assumed, they give their opinion, but nobody listens to what they're saying?
I don't think we should use the language of sort of conservation in the context of what the local people think. They don't characterize the forest, anybody, whether it's women or men or young or older people. It's the forest is clothing, it's protection for the Tabot, the church. It's not characterized as a wonderful place ecologically. So I think the women are thinking about safety. Now, we had a lot of trouble. Actually, one of the issues was getting women to share with us their ideas. And our ethnographer, Isabella Orlowska, I think was pretty good at trying to get women to open up. But I think in answer to your question, their voices do not influence decision-making in the community to any great degree, at least in a formal process. So I think where often their views come out is, whether it's enforcing some of these rules of protection about fuelwood gathering or cutting trees, or are there kids running through the forest and trampling things? So I think it's much more in an informal way. And I guess what I'm arguing is that, is there a way, and I recognize that there are gender bias and all kinds of challenges in the context of Ethiopia, but I think the outside groups are ignoring the importance of women who historically have been part of maintaining these protection systems. And the younger people, I don't think it's that they don't go to church. It's that their connection to the church forest, the way they value that as a gathering space and an important place to protect, may be weakening, kind of in a social capital sense. So they're starting to have more of their orientation towards secular society. And that's a hypothesis. So, we haven't been able to prove anything yet, but I'm guessing that may be a factor in why you see some weakening enforcement of these norms of protection among certain groups of people. So yeah, you don't see this sort of conservation dialogue happening outside of the church forest context for reasons that I think are what I've explained, but there may be other things going on as well. Good questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. There is a question in the chat, and at this point, I do want to encourage everybody again for comments and questions. So again, two options: either send it to everybody at the same time, which is probably the most convenient, or send it to us as the moderators. So Charlotte here has a question regarding who's benefiting from the narrative, right? I think you made a strong case, and I'm just summarizing her question here, that there are certain actors, especially the NGOs and international organizations and conservation actors, that benefit from this threat narrative, where the forests need to be protected against overpopulation and all the other evils that man is producing. While the locals have more an interest in their cultural and social norms, and the ecological benefit is kind of a co-benefit, as you mentioned. So Charlotte's question is then, against that background, where do you see the possible overlaps between the ecological and the social cultural issues? Or do those narratives really resonate with each other? Or are they part, basically, I'm just rephrasing, are they part of the same coin? Or is that something that's competing with each other?
I mean, there's certainly areas of overlap. I mean, I would argue that the local people, at least the ones I talk to, are not worried about climate change, at least in the sense of that's on a day-to-day. They are not concerned about biodiversity loss. In fact, they're actively, hunting the monkeys or getting rid of the monkeys that are in the church forest. I mean, they have maybe perhaps a different set of priorities. And obviously the outside groups, and I include myself in that group. I'm an environmentalist. I do want to help protect biodiversity. I do think that if church forests were expanded, it could help in terms of adaptive capacity for local people to climate change. I mean, I think there'd be local and regional benefits. But there are, I think, opportunities. So for example, the land tenure uncertainty issue, for example, actually some of the local governments in Ethiopia have been very effective at helping to resolve disputes among, say, the church leadership or priests and farmers who think they have access to land right along the church, and promoting compromises that might allow for maybe tree planting in that buffer zone, or compromises that could be mutually beneficial. So I guess what I'm suggesting is a deeper understanding of what people value, what their needs are, both in terms of development and in order to maintain their spiritual needs, might lead to a diversification of protective options. So if you could, in addition to maybe walls are necessary as an emergency step, but these are big, tall walls. And the reason that most priests are accepting them is that they see it as honoring the Tabut. I mean, it's all about the religious values. Whereas there may be other types of strategies. If you could engage young people and women, for example, in dialogue to a greater degree, you might find ways to strengthen these kind of common property, social norms that have been protecting the forest in the past. So I think I don't have a silver bullet solution, but I think that there needs to be a broadening of the conversation beyond just this. We have an emergency, have a crisis, put up as many walls as you can, as fast as you can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Then there's another comment from Irene, and she's just giving an emphasis on the point that about the priests. So she's saying that it's biblical. So probably they were using the biblical approach, the leadership of the church, but also the NGO, the external NGOs need also to talk to the priests so that they can work together in conservation.
Yeah, I agree. And I should note that Alamayu is an ordained priest. So he is Ethiopian. He is a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so he knows the liturgy very well. And yet I think that the aspect, and again, I don't mean to publicly criticize him. I think he's highlighted the role of church forests, their importance ecologically, and the need for, I guess, appreciation about their vulnerability. But I guess I am critiquing that he overstates the crisis in many cases. And I think the approach of educating priests, just that outsiders coming in a relatively short period of time, and over a few decades, deciding that they're in crisis and we need walls. I think that's moving quickly. So there's a tension though between this perceived crisis and a need to move more slowly. So given the way in which outsiders have characterized environmental issues in Africa and Ethiopia in the past, and mistakenly so, I'm leery about the approach thus far. And I certainly think there may be ways to highlight some elements of the religious tradition and encourage local communities or collaborate with them for other types of response options. I'm a little uncomfortable with this sort of one direction information flow that we tend to be seeing right now.
Thanks a lot. Just to let everybody know, this will be, after this, the last round of questions. But I do want to, because you mentioned the information flow, and I mean, the Times comes there, the big outlets, the National Geographic, they go there, and they basically, as you've really nicely shown at the beginning of your talk, they present this story. And of course, that's what journalists do. They're not researchers, but why is this neo-Malthusian story that it's like, okay, there's degradation, but there's some island of hope? That's not what they said, but that's me paraphrasing. There's some island of hope, and basically Africa is going down the drain, but there are some highlights, and we need to protect them, and they are under threat by population growth. Why are they always going for that? Are they like talking to the wrong people, or is that what they think is selling their magazines? Or maybe you should give them more interviews. I don't know. Your thoughts would be really, I would appreciate your thoughts on this.
I actually have tried to engage with some of the authors. It's amazingly hard sometimes to do that. Some of the people are journalists and filmmakers, and I've just written a chapter that is written to be accessible to a broad audience, and I haven't had much traction. I think certainly, and this is beyond the scope of my talk, but I think there are lots of scholarship demonstrating how a lot of people in the Western world do see Africa in a very negative light, and do see environment in a very negative light, tend to highlight, charismatic megafauna as good, and somehow people having some kind of negative influence on the environment. So I think that backdrop is pervasive. I certainly would argue that they are beautiful places. You have sort of the imagery, the stark imagery, the fact that they are incredibly biodiverse and photogenic. I think it lends itself to this story. And you look at those images that I shared with you. If I hadn't done research on this, I would have said, isn't that sad, right? Look, these forests are just completely disappearing, and you see this stark divide. I just think it's a story that can captivate people. So I think that's part of it. I think it's part of the conventional wisdom, the received knowledge that a lot of us have about Africa. And that said, I know the ecologists, they come from a good place. And I recognize how difficult it is to come up with sort of an adaptive strategy that is a win-win-win, right? But I do see, I guess I'm raising some concerns. I'm not trying to argue walls are always bad. I'm saying this is a very aggressive approach. It's happening very fast, and we perhaps should slow down a little bit.
Yes, and I think, as you mentioned in your presentation as well, it's also picked up by local actors very much, and also promoted. It's not something that's coming exclusively from the outside, right? Correct.
And again, I know Jim McCann has done a lot more work on this than I have. I'm a newcomer to Ethiopia. I've just been working there since 2012. But we've seen reference to this high rate of deforestation again and again. And yet scholars like Jim, who carefully look at where the data is coming from, find out that it's not on very solid footing. That said, there clearly is forest disturbance. So yes, we should acknowledge that, but let's not just, it can't be one extreme or another. Let's have a bit more of a nuanced perspective, because that may indeed suggest some alternative response options if we think they're necessary.
Thank you for that. There's another question from Charlotte, and it's just a follow-up question. She's saying also borders that protect what's inside, but also keep others out. And talk of crisis also often serves as legitimate and use of power. Do you think that keeping others out or showing power by controlling access is the reason behind the walls?
I mean, obviously they're there. I think the main reason ecologists would argue that the walls are there is for cattle. And it is certainly true. There are a lot of livestock, and they wander in and out, and they do damage. Although, the ecologists, including people on my research team, have done studies of churches with walls and without walls. And the ecological benefit is there for the walls, but not as much as you would think, which suggests it's not just about cattle, because people, whether the walls are there or not, are entering every Sunday. The whole community goes into this forest for church services and to have these association gatherings. So there are other things going on. It is certainly true that these are social spaces, and I think the walls, if people are perceiving them as a kind of a confrontational stay out, I think that's a negative thing, because these are very much part of maintaining the social capital of the community. So certainly symbolically, I think we all would agree walls have got a fraught history, and so that's something that might be of concern. To what degree the local people perceive it in that way, I'm not entirely sure. So that's a good question.
Okay, I already kind of made it to my end statement, but there's one last question that I'll take now that Tabea asked, and she's asking, are there actually church forest communities that want to create bigger forests, like to spread the holiness, she's saying, in the outside world? And couldn't that be a starting point for encouraging environmental protection projects? So basically use that,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good question. And yes, there's variability among church forest priests. Some are more, innovative in their thinking. Some people are building their walls beyond the perimeter of the forest and planting not just eucalyptus, but planting native species. The government has government tree nurseries, and they will give seedlings to church forests. So certainly there are planting initiatives. My ecologist, Kat Carluce, my colleague at Colgate, Kat Carluce, had a dream of hers was to create tree nurseries and kind of facilitate this expansion. So yes, I do think that would be something that the communities would celebrate, and that may be maybe in tandem with walls as kind of a temporary barrier, maybe could lead to an expansion. So I think that's a strong possibility.
Probably just a question on what you have responded on. You talked about trees being given to the churches. I'm sorry, Ann Peter. I'm just curious to know, do they just give out trees, or do they consult the church to know that the tree species that they actually want to plant?
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that. They tend to have a couple of varieties that they'll give out. So it's an example again of, well, we assume that these are the trees that local people want. And maybe they're more iconic varieties. I don't think the government is, at least the federal government is engaging in that kind of back and forth about what people want. I think it's a little different with local government, but local government is much more centered on development priorities and less on church forest protection. So it's a good question, and I don't think the dialogue about that is particularly open either. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the Corona project in your presentation. That seemed to have been really helpful for you. Well, the current Corona project, wherever it's from or made of, seems to be less helpful to us, but we will get through it. And it does encourage us to use these new formats as we've done today. And I think it is also an opportunity you had to have an international crowd as we had today. So with this, I really want to thank you, all participants, for your interest, for your comments, for your questions. That really gives us another dimension. And so there are advantages to these online formats. I also, of course, want to thank you, Rowan, as a co-host and the technical support. And not the least, Pete, of course, you. It has been a fascinating talk, really nice insight, well balanced. I could go on. But we will catch up, and hopefully we have a teller. I learned that is a whole idea at some point.
It tastes like an ashtray to me, but others clearly like it.
Okay, we will have to try it anyway at some point. With this, I thank everybody and wish you a nice evening or nice day, whatever time zone you are in. And please stay tuned for more from the Friedensakademie, from the Peace Academy, Rheinland-Palatinate. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Everyone.